3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Welcome to The People's Historian, a weekly podcast that takes you on a journey through time with amazing stories from our collective past. Your host, Professor of History and Professional Public Historian, Dr. Gabriel Selassie. Today, what we're going to talk about is the history of American policing. This is a really fascinating topic given all of the trauma surrounding George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the numerous other black people who've been killed by police. This is my first podcast in a number of days, and it's rather obvious that you all know that we're going through this epidemic of COVID, and so everything is going online. And as you know, that I am a faculty member, and so we've moved all of our courses online, and so the rush of doing all of that and transitioning over has been quite hectic. But here at the People's Historian, we thought that one of the most prudent things that we could do, particularly today, is talk about American policing. And this is largely due to the fact that, as many of you should already know by now, that an African-American male named George Floyd was brutally murdered in front of a number of people. And of course, those people had cell phone cameras, so it was all witnessed. And of course, there was a camera from the store that witnessed everything. And of course, now we know some things like the police lied and said that Floyd was resisting arrest. And of course, he was not. But what has been going on is there's been some reflection, and I've been sort of sneaking and listening to certain things. My wife has a podcast that she listens to from the Hill called Rise, and I was just kind of sneaking and listening to that, and I was just listening to just the commentators on there, and there's 2 or 3 of them. And I for the life of me, I don't listen to Rise, but it's following the same patterns that these individuals, they're young, they really have no clue as to the history of policing and why African Americans are doing things like rioting after Rodney King, the Watts riots, etc. They can't altogether put everything into context. And that's somewhat of a shame, because the history of American policing, if you know it, would allow you to understand that rebellions and looting are rational reactions to police violence. So, depending upon your age, you're probably thinking that, well, in my lifetime, how bad policing is. And let me tell you, as an American historian, policing in the United States has always been bad. But before we get into the history, and because we are the People's Historian, we do history, we're going to do somewhat of an overview on the history of policing, and we'll try to get it done in about 30 minutes, but that's what our target goal is. Now, of course, Minneapolis, not only the murder of George Floyd has problems, but if you remember, Philando Castile was also murdered in 2017 by Geronimo Jimenez. Now, he was found not guilty, or I shouldn't say not guilty, but he was acquitted in 2017. And he's the officer that fired through Castile's window after Castile told him that he was a registered gun owner. And of course, if you look at the video and watch the video, there's no doubt in my mind that the jury made a wrong-headed decision. But nevertheless, we have a court system here that if you're found not guilty, you get to go free. It doesn't mean that you didn't commit murder, which I believe that he did, but nevertheless, that's just my basic opinion. Then you should have known that after the results of the shooting of Philando Castile, that Black Lives Matter and other groups shut down Highway 94 And I need to just say here that the reason why Castile was killed or pulled over in the first place was for a broken taillight. So you square the sum on that one, where how do you end up dead because you have a broken taillight? And of course, we can talk about Sandra Bland, who was pulled over for some minor infraction, changing lanes. There was Breonna Taylor, who was just 26 years old, on March 13th of this year, who was murdered by the police in Louisville. The police executed a warrantless search. Now, I was a military police officer, criminal investigator supervisor, and for me, warrantless searches are absolutely ridiculous. All they're done is because you need to have speed, and what you need to do is to have proper planning and proper training to kind of do those. And Breonna Taylor was completely innocent, sleeping in her bed. The police burst down the doors. They woke up. And of course, they thought that someone was trying to break in. At least Breonna's boyfriend did. He was killed and she was shot umpteenth number of times. But you can go back to also Tamir Rice, who was a 12-year-old boy in Cleveland who was killed by Timothy Loman, the police officer. And if you look up Timothy Loman, he has a number of issues and problems. And he was a 12-year-old boy playing in a park with a gun. And we all know, growing up in America, at least if you grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, every kid had a gun, and you went to the park and played cops and robbers, or, good guys, bad guys, Indians, or whatever. But he was shot down almost immediately as the police officer, Timothy Loman, pulled up on him and killed him. So you can quite understand, and of course you know about Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed by vigilantes. Now, he wasn't killed by the police, but the police then refused to arrest these men for, one, kidnapping at bare minimum, and the other one, of course, he was gunned down for jogging, essentially. Now, why this is such an issue is because of just basic statistics. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to say things like, well, every community suffers in police brutality. And if that's true, but the power of mathematics is that it brings things out into the light. Once you run the numbers, then you're able to see problems. This is why we keep statistics. In 2016, there were 233 blacks killed by police, and this is according to the Smithsonian Magazine. Black people represent about 13% of the American population, but they represent, at least in 2016, about 24% of all the people killed by police. So just from looking at the statistics, there must be something wrong. How is it that you're only 13% of the population, but yet you make up nearly a quarter, essentially, of all of the police shootings? And the conclusion that you can draw from that is that there is something wrong with the interaction between the police in the United States and black communities. Now, of course, today, the big news is the rioting that is taking place in Minneapolis. And for me, I'm sort of immune to all of this. And I'm immune to it essentially because, for two things. I'm immune to it for the people who are rioting, essentially from the fact that, what good is going to come out of that, right? We could ask that question and you could say, well, the rioting is going to teach people a lesson. Look, Watts riots, Rodney King didn't teach the police a lesson, didn't teach anybody a lesson. White police officers are still murdering black people at a disproportionate rate. Simple as that. So what you need to do, instead of rioting and looting stores, you need to be rioting and looting the institutions that are responsible for this. And of course, these institutions aren't anything that are made of concrete. These are in people's minds. So what you need to do is change the dialogue. But that's for a whole nother story. Today, what we're going to do is talk about the history of American policing. Now, of course, I get my knowledge because this isn't a subject that I study. I just have, because I'm an African American, I have firsthand experience with police officers. Most of them, 99% of them, have been white police officers, and a handful of them have been Latino and Black, and quite a number of Asians who were basically probably not suited for work in the police department. I get my information from a researcher by the name of Dr. Gary Potter, who has written a small treatise, about 16 pages, and I'll post this on my Twitter feed, The People's Historian, at The People's Historian, or you can, if you send me an email message, I'll gladly send that to you. But he wrote a very interesting treatise on modern policing in the United States. And I'm going to go over his work, right? I'm going to at least summarize his work because I think what he did was quite interesting. Now, what he argues here is that modern policing in the United States actually began around the mid-17th century, particularly starting in Boston and then moving its way in 1636 to New York by 1658, and then by the 18th century, 1700, in Philadelphia. So we see the rise of police departments out of Boston, and then New York City, and then Philadelphia, and of course then the outgrowth from there. And it seems customary because, of course, the United States was founded by Europeans beginning on the East Coast and moving out west with this concept of manifest destiny. And what he argues here is that policing grew out of private policing, or what they called the night watch. In other words, there were people who had means who could hire individuals who would protect their personal property. Now, you're probably thinking about this in some extraordinary way, and well, why is that important? Well, it's important in the fact that if you're being paid by somebody, your interests completely lie in the person that is giving you money. Hence, that's why we have very few, almost no, that I can think of, police departments that are in private hands. We have them that we probably export elsewhere, like paramilitary groups, that sort of thing. And we have security guards, but to a degree, American policing is a public institution run by local communities and states. And so you can see here why that would be a problem having private policing. We began to see centralized police departments beginning to rise in 1830 Boston, and they had by 1838 the first American police force. Now, remember here, this is in the North, and we're going to see, of course, these police forces, right, growing out of these night watches because New York and Philadelphia had these things. We're going to see them spring up after 1838. Chicago, New Orleans, etc., all of these cities followed. Now, what is interesting about this and what Potter makes the argument here is that these police departments had a mandate. And this mandate, and I'm talking about strictly here in the North, right? This mandate was, one, to strike out against mob violence against blacks and immigrants. And I'm not talking about immigrants coming over from Northern Europe. I'm talking about those immigrants who were coming to the United States from places like Ireland, right, who were not considered to be essentially white people, right? So if you're interested, there's an interesting book called How the Irish Became White. But in that book, you'll see what I'm talking about. But here, what we're talking about is that in the North, largely these police departments sprang out of a need to control swarthy immigrant populations and black people who were free living in northern cities. Hence, the root of the problem. So we have in the North police departments that are growing out of this sense of mob control. Now, in the South, we have an altogether different problem, right? Because what Potter shows here through the research by others, because he's basically pulling together primary sources and secondary sources to make his arguments here, which I think are very valid, is that the South instituted its police departments from a very different conception, beginning in the very early 18th century, around 1704 in the North, in the Carolinas, right? Both North and South Carolina. And they were the result, or they were slave patrols. When I was a young person, my older cousins, etc., when I would go down south, they would say things like, if you're not good, the patty rollers would get you. And the patty rollers, in a sense, were slave patrollers. So what slave patrollers were basically poor whites who were given the authority and money, private hence, to terrorize both small free black communities in the South, and to look for runaway slaves. These slave patrols were exceptionally brutal, castration, lynchings, you name it. And they eventually turned into police departments. So these vigilante groups were then turned into police departments, and their main goal was to, of course, put down insurrection by black people. And it's not just the fear of insurrection, slave rebellions, and after slavery ended, the black population, but they were largely instituted in social control. And what I mean by that is that by the time we get to the first and second migrations in the 19-teens, where black people were fleeing the South because of the terror, these groups were then instructed to round up black people who were fleeing and bring them back so they could work on those plantations just as though they were in fact slaves. As police departments began to emerge from sort of this vigilantism from both the North and the South, the police departments began to take on a somewhat different character, according to Potter. And what he argues here is that police departments, as they began to spring up after the Civil War, right, and slavery had ended, one, to provide peaceful and tranquil communities, and to ensure commerce could be conducted within those cities free of what have you. Now, this to me is fascinating and exceedingly interesting, because what it says here is that the structure of capitalism needed to have some form of police control so that the means of production, those people who owned factories, etc., could stamp out strikes by its workforce. Now, why this is connected, I believe, to what's going on in Minneapolis right now is because of the rebellion. Some people would call it rioting. The early labor strikes were always called riots by the police departments and the powers that be. These were nothing more than primitive labor strikes, according to Potter, and I agree with that because I know enough about early history of labor organizing to know that. And if you're interested in that, you can just go onto YouTube and type in Mother Jones, and you can read the full story about coal mining, labor organizing, and how police departments were used to brutally suppress those populations in places like West Virginia and Kentucky. So what these police departments then turned into were instruments of exploitation so that they could control the means of production. They were illusions of maintaining order. Right? So they gave people this illusion that they were there to ensure that your property was not stolen, right? So you leave your wheelbarrow somewhere and somebody walks off of it. Right? Police departments aren't here for that kind of stuff. Let somebody know, call the police department today and tell them that your wheelbarrow was stolen or your bicycle, and see how long it takes them to show up. They won't ever come. Right? So it's not about protecting your property. It is always about social control. And if you don't know that, I don't know what to tell you. So The question here then becomes social controlling who? So then this takes us back then to our two main populations, the boogeyman in American society. One, black people and immigrants. Right, so here in Los Angeles, where we have a large Latino population, we have a problem with Latino males being murdered by the LAPD. Hence, immigrant populations. Early American policing was corrupt, flagrantly brutal. They accepted bribes, stuffed ballot boxes, engaged in vote buying, strike breaking, which we already talked about. This is all coupled with the fact that there was a large discussion when these police departments were starting to form about whether or not police departments ought to have guns. So the use of force was something that was debated and talked about. As a matter of fact, police officers, one, didn't even want to wear uniforms because they didn't want to be seen doing their dirt because people could obviously identify them if you're wearing a uniform. So even early police departments and police officers bucked at the fact that they had to wear uniforms. How police were able to get a hold of guns in the United States is because the elites, of course, who are controlling the wheels of capitalism, are demanding that police officers be armed. Now, I'm not sure about you, but my experience with police officers has always been in police departments is that there are just far too many people who don't have the psychological makeup to carry guns, to wear badges. By the time we get to the 1930s, prohibition made policing worse. Prohibition, if you don't know what that is that we had a constitutional amendment where we outlawed alcohol, which was one of the dumbest political maneuvers in the history of the United States. And the reason why prohibition was instituted, if you don't know, because Americans drink a lot. And we had a problem in the United States with men drinking so much that they would go home and beat their wives and children. We had a super problem with this because not only would they wreak havoc within their homes, but they'd spend all their money in bars. Working extremely hard in early 20th century America probably drove many people to drink. These police departments in the 1930s, rather than fighting crime, aligned themselves up with crime. Now, I know you're probably sitting there and saying to me, well, Professor Selassie, not all police departments. Of course, we know that. But that's not the point. Go to any big city in the United States, 1930s, the alcohol is getting in. Joseph Kennedy became a wealthy man from the importation of Irish whiskey into the United States. Now, how did that happen? Because people are in on the take. The police departments in the 1930s aligned themselves nationally with organized crime. Prostitution, for example, here in Los Angeles, Chief Edward Kearns, who was appointed police chief in around 1907, ran a prostitution syndicate. Arnold Rothstein, who was a mentor to people like Lucky Luciano, etc., he was actually assassinated by a New York Police Department chief in 1928. And why? Because he refused to pay a gambling debt on a rigged card game. In Philadelphia, there were rival gangs within city government. The mayor had his own gang and the police department had its own gang. Mayor Rizzo, who was police chief and mayor he was police chief from like 68 to 72 or so, and then mayor of Philadelphia from roughly 72 to roughly 1980, Frank Rizzo. His entire police department was on the take. And this is not something out of speculation. A commission was organized, and they said the entire Philadelphia police department was absolutely and completely corrupt. If you really want to see how the Philadelphia police department worked, all you have to do is go and watch how the Philadelphia Police Department conducted itself with ousting the MOVE organization. They murdered people, shot them in cold blood as they were exiting a burning building. Nothing ever happened to those police officers, and it's all on film. By the time we get to the 1950s, the buzzword became police professionalism. There was a man by the name of O.W. Wilson who brought in this idea that police departments ought to be professionalized, centralized police departments, military style and organization. So that's why police officers wear stripes and all of that kind of somewhat ridiculous stuff. Right? So they militarized themselves. The tactics were borrowed from the military. Particularly all of those soldiers coming out of World War II needed jobs, and they joined police departments, and they saw themselves as fighting crime. Not deterring crime like you fight Nazis, fighting American citizens. And of course, the brunt of this fighting military styled policing was wreaked on to minority communities, hence the Watts riots from August of 1965. Right? Series of police brutality and eventually erupted into a large-scale riot. By the time we get to the 1960s, all social aspects of policing were wiped out. There's a concept, if you're not familiar with it, called Taylorism. Frederick Winslow Taylor developed this idea how to make factories much, much more productive and efficient. Right? So things like middle managers were instituted, time clock efficiency, all of that kind of stuff. You can look it up. And that was the policy about police departments. Efficiency, Taylorism, was instituted within these police departments. So you had things like people riding in patrol cars so people didn't walk beats any longer. Single policemen instead of two policemen. So instead of feeling like you have backup, you're always out there on your own. And so then, of course, when you're confronted, you can immediately move towards your service weapon. So all social aspects are discouraged. Taylorism is instituted. Time clock efficiency. So that's why people will ask police officers, how many tickets did you give in a certain time period? And if you haven't given any, you must not be doing your job. So by the time we get to the 1960s, North and South police departments are used, of course, to stifle dissent again. And this time it's with the civil rights movement. We also begin to see the police departments being turned on young white kids in anti-Vietnam protests. But all in all, this idea that police departments are used as a tool of social repression is fundamentally in the very DNA of police departments in the United States. Now, I am a European citizen, and for example, I think it's in Sweden, where it takes nearly 2 years to become a police officer. In some places, you can become a police officer in a matter of hours. I mean, literally. You don't have to have any weapons training in some places to become police officers in the United States. In Italy, the Carabinieri, to become a police officer in the Carabinieri takes you 4 years. Almost no police officers here in the United States could make that training. For one, there are obvious weight requirements, which half the police officers in the United States wouldn't be able to get through. And there's just the training is just completely fundamentally different. Police officers in Europe are held to a higher standard. There is no presumption of innocence. And when police officers shoot their people that they're arresting, there are serious investigations, not like here in the United States, where you automatically know, and I know what you're thinking. If you're an African American, you almost certainly know that those police officers, those 4 police officers who murdered George Floyd, are probably going to get off. You know this. By the time we get to the late 1960s, we're starting to see things like community policing being reinstituted. And of course, community policing has been an absolute failure. Black Lives Matter is a direct result of the failure of community policing within the United States. So make no bones about it, no matter how you're going to try to twist this, what we can conclude from Dr. Potter's work on policing is that police departments have one mission, and that is to control black people. Their secondary mission is, of course, to control immigrants. And of course, these happen to be, in some cases, Asians and African Americans. Go to the Hmong community and see the havoc that is wreaked with Hmong males. So we're going to wrap up here, but I just want to put this out there for those of you who have no understanding of the police departments. Yeah, if you're a white man in America, the police department serves your community. Because what it's doing is it's keeping those immigrants and black people at bay. If you're an African American or other minority in the United States, the police department is an invading force. So what needs to be done? First of all, good-natured white people who see the murder of George Floyd as the canary in the coal mine, finally. Not that Tamir Rice or George Zimmerman, who committed his crime, which he was duly acquitted. You have to do something about the police force that serves you. They don't serve black people. It's upon you to do something about it. Because black people can't do anything about it because we represent such a small number of people in the United States. This is something that we can't solve. The second thing that probably needs to be done is police departments have to be completely dismantled. Only in the United States will you allow some town to come up with his own police department. It doesn't happen anywhere. In almost all cases in the world, including Europe, police officers are nationalized or they work for the state. And the reason why that's better is because there are national standards of policing. A chokehold in one city is routinely used and it is not used in other cities. This is the only way forward. And if you're going to argue with me, oh, we don't want to create another bureaucracy in the federal government. Yeah, because what you're happy with and what you're content with is more black people being murdered. The only way forward is to dismantle police forces in the United States and nationalize them. As a matter of fact, what you probably need to do is just increase the requirements. Nobody who has a high school diploma only should be allowed to be a police officer. You need to have people with college degrees. Increase the pay for police officers. United States police officer with a high school diploma make $100,000 easily. So why can't a police officer, say in a small town in Kansas, make $100,000? We would get better police officers. The requirements would be stricter. Well, this is all we have for today on American policing because we're vastly going over our time here. Like I said, shoot me a message on Twitter, at the People's Historian, or you can get my email address. It's readily available, and you can chat with me about what you think is the way forward for police departments. Thank you very much, and I highly thank you for listening to another episode of The People's Historian. I am your host, Dr. Gabriel Selassie.